I thought I knew every inch of my Anthony's soul until I found that hidden photograph that would change everything I believed about our marriage. Good morning, my dears. I'm Mrs. Cecilia. I'm 83 years old, and today I'm going to share with you a story I've kept in my heart for many, many years. Before I begin, I'd like to ask you who are watching now to please leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It makes me so happy to know my story is reaching so many different places. It was 1958. I was only 19 years old, with long black hair down to my waist and dreams as big as the sky over Riverdale, the small town where I was born and raised. In those days, we didn't have many options besides marrying young. My father was strict, one of those men who thought a woman should go straight from her parents' house to her husband's house. And that's exactly what happened to me. I met Anthony at a 4th of July celebration. He was 25 years old, worked at the post office, had a stable job, and was respected in the community. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a smile that lit up any room. It didn't take long for him to ask my father's permission to court me. I remember it like it was yesterday. Him all formal, in a suit and tie, holding his hat in his hands, waiting in the living room while my father sized him up. Our courtship lasted only 6 months. That's how it was back then. None of this dating for years like nowadays. We got married in a simple ceremony at the town church, complete with a white dress that my mother and aunts had hand-sewn for weeks. It was the happiest day of my life. At least, that's what I thought at the time. The first years were like a dream. Anthony was attentive, affectionate, and soon our children came along. First Charles in 1959, then Marianne in 1961, and finally James in 1963. Our house was always full, noisy, and happy. Anthony worked hard to support us all, and I took care of the house and children. We were what you might call a perfect family in everyone's eyes. But in 1965, after 7 years of marriage, things began to change. Anthony started working overtime, coming home later and later. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night and find him in the living room, sitting in his armchair, staring into space with a glass of whiskey in his hand. When I asked what was happening, he always said the same thing. "Nothing, Cecilia, just tired from work." I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He'd never given me reason to doubt. Until that Wednesday afternoon in April 1965. I even remember what the weather was like. A sunny day with a cool breeze coming through the windows while I was washing his clothes. As usual, I emptied his pockets before putting the items in to wash. That's when I found it, carefully folded in the inside pocket of his jacket. A small photograph, one of those black and white ones, slightly yellowed around the edges. It was the face of a young woman, pretty, with light hair and a shy smile. On the back of the photo, just the initials HS, handwritten. My heart raced in my chest. My hands began to tremble. I felt a chill in my stomach that I'd never felt before. Who was this woman? Why was my husband carrying her picture hidden in his jacket? Was she the reason for the overtime hours, the sleepless nights, the distant look he'd been showing in recent months? That night, I couldn't sleep. Lying beside Anthony, I watched his serene face as he slept and wondered how many secrets he was keeping from me. The next day, I put the photo back, exactly where I'd found it. I decided to observe, to wait, to try to understand what was happening before confronting him. The following weeks were absolute torment. I lived divided between the woman who washed, ironed, cooked, and cared for the children with a smile on her face, and the woman who inside was being torn apart by jealousy and insecurity. I began to notice small details that had gone unnoticed before. Mysterious phone calls that he answered and quickly hung up when I entered the room. Letters that arrived without a return address that he kept under lock and key. And the perfume. A different perfume that I sometimes smelled on his clothes. At that time, we didn't have all the freedom that women have today. A wife questioning her husband was almost disrespectful. And divorce? Unthinkable. It was a scandal that would mark not only the woman, but also the children for the rest of their lives. Besides, I didn't work outside the home. How would I support 3 young children alone? Society didn't forgive a separated woman, and my own parents probably wouldn't take me back. So I suffered in silence, swallowing my tears when I went to bed alone because Anthony had yet another important meeting at work. I watched my children asking for their father and made up excuses to justify his absence. Daddy's working very hard to give us a good life, I would say, while inside my heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. Then the trips began. First once a month, then every 2 weeks. Anthony said they were to resolve work matters in other cities. Each time he announced a new trip, I noticed how his eyes would light up differently, as if he were eager to leave. During one of these trips, in June 1966, while he was away, I made a decision that would change our lives forever. The children were at school, and I had the house to myself. With a racing heart and trembling hands, I entered the small office Anthony kept at home, a room where we rarely went. It was his sacred space, where he kept his documents and worked when he brought work home. I began opening drawers, rummaging through papers, looking for any clue that could give me answers. That's when I found it, hidden under a stack of old documents, a shoebox. Inside were letters, several letters addressed to someone named Helen Stevens. The letters weren't opened. They were letters Anthony had written but, for some reason, hadn't sent. With trembling hands, I opened one and began to read. Dear Helen, I continue my tireless search for you. So many years have passed, but I won't give up until I find you. The little information I have indicates you might be in Boston. Next week I'll travel there again. The hope of finally seeing you face to face is what keeps me going forward. Anthony. I picked up another, more recent letter, dated just a month ago. Helen, I finally have concrete news. The lady I spoke with said she knew you and confirmed you were living at the address I discovered. She said you moved a few years ago, but believes you're still in the city. I'm so close. I can feel it. Next week, I'll be there again, and I won't return without answers. You can't imagine how hard it's been to keep this secret all these years. Sometimes I think about telling Cecilia everything, but I'm afraid of how she would react. Our family has already been through so much suffering. I don't want to open old wounds. With hope, Anthony. I read and reread those letters several times, trying to understand what was happening. Who was this Helen that my husband was so desperately searching for? What did she mean to him? And what was this secret that he couldn't share with me? The photo I found in his jacket was certainly of Helen. But what kind of relationship did they have? Was she an old girlfriend? A current lover? Someone for whom he still had deep feelings? The questions multiplied in my head, and each one was like a needle in my heart. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it and left the office with more questions than answers. In the following weeks, I observed Anthony even more carefully. I noticed how he seemed more anxious, more distracted. Sometimes I caught him looking at the photograph when he thought he was alone, with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't passion or desire. It was something different, something I couldn't identify. It was on a Sunday afternoon in August 1966 that I received the phone call that would change everything. The deep voice on the other end informed me that Anthony had been in a car accident on the highway between Boston and our town. He was alive but in serious condition, hospitalized in a small town along the way. I left the children with my sister and took the first bus available. The 4-hour journey seemed like an eternity. My mind was racing with worries. What if he died? What if he became disabled? How would I care for him and the children alone? And in the midst of all these swirling thoughts, one persistent question. Was he going to or coming from a meeting with her, with Helen? When I finally arrived at the hospital, Anthony was unconscious, with several injuries and a broken leg. The doctor informed me that he had hit his head hard and had a high fever due to an infection that had developed in one of the wounds. The next 24 hours will be crucial, he said, with that seriousness that only doctors can have when delivering grave news. I stayed by his bedside all night, holding his hand, saying every prayer I knew. Around 3 in the morning, Anthony began to become delirious because of the fever. He mumbled disconnected words, names I didn't recognize, and then clearly he called for her. "Helen, Helen, I finally found you, Helen." Those words were like daggers in my chest. So it was true. He had been with her when he had the accident. Maybe he was returning from a meeting with her. Or maybe he was planning to abandon us to be with her once and for all. I cried silently beside his bed, feeling my world crumble. After so many years together, 3 children, an entire life built, how could he do this to me? I began to plan what I would do when he woke up. Confront him, pretend I didn't know anything, pack my bags and leave with the children. The next morning, the fever decreased, and Anthony finally opened his eyes. Seeing me, a weak smile formed on his injured lips. "Cecilia," he whispered, "you came." I swallowed my tears and replied, "Of course I came. I'm your wife." We were silent for a few moments. Then I gathered courage and asked, "Who is Helen, Anthony?" He closed his eyes, and for a moment I thought he had gone back to sleep. But then I saw a tear run down the corner of his eye. "How do you know about Helen?" he asked, his voice breaking. "You called for her during the night while you were delirious with fever," I replied, feeling my heart tighten. "And I found her photo in your jacket and the letters. Anthony, I found the letters you wrote to her." There it was, the confrontation I had feared so much. Now there was no going back. My dears, when I told Anthony that I had discovered the letters and the photograph, I thought the world was going to collapse right there in that hospital room. I took a deep breath, expecting him to confess to an affair, to tell me he loved another woman. I prepared my heart to hear the worst words a wife can hear, but what happened next caught me completely off guard. Anthony closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, there was a mixture of relief and fear in his gaze. He stretched out his trembling hand, took mine, and squeezed with what little strength he had. "Cecilia," he began with a low, tired voice, "it's not what you're thinking. Helen is not my lover." I remember sitting in silence, not knowing whether to believe him. After all, what other explanation could there be for the secret trips, the hidden letters, the photograph kept so carefully? "Helen is my sister," he finally said. I felt as if the air had been knocked out of my lungs. Sister? In almost 8 years of marriage, Anthony had never mentioned having a sister. He always told me he was an only child, that his parents had died when he was young, and that he had no family besides a distant uncle in New York. "What do you mean, your sister? Why did you never tell me about her? Why all this secrecy?" Anthony asked for a glass of water, and as I helped him drink, I noticed his hands were trembling even more. Then, with a choked voice, he began to tell me a story I never imagined hearing. When I was 6 years old and Helen only 4, our parents separated. It was a terrible separation, full of fights and resentment. My father took me, and my mother took Helen. They made a cruel agreement. Each would go their own way with one of the children and never have contact again. It was as if they wanted to completely erase the past. As he spoke, I saw the pain etched on his face, an old, deep pain that he had carried for decades. I grew up asking about my sister, but my father refused to talk about her. He said it was better this way, that we should move forward. When I turned 15, my father suffered a stroke, and before he died, he finally told me that my mother and Helen had moved to Massachusetts. That was all I could get out of him. At that moment, I began to understand the weight of the secret Anthony carried. I imagined the little boy who was separated from his little sister, without being able to say goodbye, growing up with that absence, with that open wound. After my father died, I went to live with my uncle in New York. I started working early and saved every penny I could to one day look for Helen and my mother, but I had no concrete leads. I only knew they had gone to Massachusetts. When we got married, he continued, I had already accepted that I might never find them. I had learned to live with that pain. And then, about 2 years ago, I received a letter from an old neighbor from when my parents were married. She had tracked me down through the post office address and said she had found my mother by chance in Boston. My mother had passed away a few months earlier, but Helen was alive and living in the same city. Tears were streaming down Anthony's face as he spoke. Tears of a boy who grew up without his sister, without his mother, carrying an absence that no one could fill. "Why didn't you tell me, Anthony? Why did you hide this from me all this time?" I asked, trying to understand. He took a deep breath before answering. "At first, I was afraid of awakening all that pain that I had managed to bury. Later, when I received the letter and began looking for Helen, I was afraid of creating expectations and not finding her. What if she didn't want to see me? What if she didn't even remember me? We were so young when they separated us. I thought about how difficult it must have been for him to keep all of that to himself. The trips to Boston, the searches without results, the hope that was renewed with each small clue and faded when he came to another dead end. The photo you found," he continued, "was sent by the neighbor. It's an old photo from when Helen was about 20 years old. It was the first time I saw my sister's face after so many years. I couldn't stop looking at her, searching for traits that reminded me of the little girl I knew, imagining what her voice would be like, her manner." As he spoke, I felt a mixture of relief and guilt wash over me. Relief, because there wasn't another woman, because my marriage wasn't threatened. Guilt for having doubted him, for having imagined the worst, for not having been the wife he could trust to share his deepest pain. "And the accident? How did it happen?" I asked. Anthony squeezed my hand harder. "I finally found her, Cecilia. After so many years, so many trips, so many false leads, I found Helen. She's living in a small town on the way to Boston. I got the address through a former colleague of hers. I went there. I stood in front of her house for hours without the courage to knock on the door. I imagined the scene. Anthony standing on the sidewalk, looking at an unfamiliar house, knowing that on the other side of the door was the sister he hadn't seen in over 30 years. The mixture of fear and hope he must have felt. When I finally got up the courage, she wasn't there. A neighbor said she had traveled to visit a friend and would return the next day. I decided to wait in town. I spent the whole day walking the streets, imagining the meeting, rehearsing what I would say. I was so nervous, so anxious. The next morning, when I was returning to her house, I lost control of the car on a curve. The tears were now flowing freely down my face. They were no longer tears of sadness or anger, but of compassion. Suddenly, everything made sense. The trips, the secret phone calls, the distant behavior. It wasn't an affair that Anthony was hiding, but a pain so deep that he didn't know how to share it. "And now? Did you manage to speak with her?" I asked. A weak smile appeared on Anthony's injured face. "Yes. She came to visit me here at the hospital yesterday before you arrived. The neighbor saw the accident and recognized my car. She notified Helen when she returned from her trip, and she came immediately." My heart raced. "She was here? Did you talk?" Anthony nodded, his eyes shining in a way I had never seen before. It was as if the 30 years we spent apart had disappeared in an instant. "She recognized me, Cecilia. She said she never forgot the older brother who protected her from everything. Our mother always talked about me to her. She kept my memory alive. Helen spent her entire life wondering where I might be, if I was well, if I had formed a family. I imagined this meeting, this moment when two souls that were separated in childhood finally reunited. It must have been a moment of such emotion, such intensity. Helen told me that our mother spent years looking for me, but my father moved addresses constantly, precisely to avoid them finding us. When he passed away and I went to live with my uncle, they completely lost track of me. She showed me pictures of our mother, told me about her final years. She said that Mom always believed that one day we would reunite. At that moment, I understood the true meaning of the photo I found in Anthony's wallet. It wasn't the image of a lover, but the only connection he had with his lost sister, with the family that was torn from him. It was a treasure that he carried close to his heart, a promise that one day he would find her. "Why didn't you tell me all this before, Anthony? Why didn't you share this pain with me?" He closed his eyes for a moment. At first, it was too difficult to talk about it. I was afraid of touching the wound and not being able to close it again. Later, when I started looking for her, I didn't want to create expectations for you and the children. And if I never found her, it would be one more disappointment to carry. Looking back now, with the wisdom that only years bring, I understand his fear. In those days, people didn't talk openly about their feelings, especially men. Showing vulnerability was seen as weakness. Anthony had been raised by his father, a rigid man of the old generation who probably never showed a hint of fragility. How could he know how to share his deepest pain? What happened after that? You must be wondering. Well, the story doesn't end in that hospital room. In fact, it was just the beginning of a new chapter in our lives. Anthony was hospitalized for 2 weeks. During that time, Helen visited him every day. At first, I was apprehensive, almost jealous of this woman who had occupied so much space in my husband's thoughts. But a few minutes of conversation were enough for me to understand why Anthony had never given up on finding her. Helen was a sweet woman, soft-spoken, with gentle eyes that resembled her brother's a lot. She had married young, like me, but had no children. Her husband had passed away a few years before, and she lived alone in the small house she inherited from him. When she learned that Anthony had a wife and 3 children, her eyes filled with tears of joy. "I have a family," she repeated. "I finally have a family again." In the days that followed, I got to know a new version of my husband. It was as if a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He smiled more, talked more, shared childhood stories that he had never mentioned before. It was as if in rediscovering Helen, he had also rediscovered a part of himself that was lost. When he was finally discharged from the hospital, Anthony made a request that caught me by surprise. He wanted Helen to come live with us, at least for a while. "Our house is small," he argued, "but we can make room. The kids will love her, I'm sure. And she's so alone, Cecilia." Just imagine, my dears, what that request from Anthony meant for me. I, who for weeks had suffered thinking my husband was cheating on me with another woman, was now being asked to open the doors of my house to this same woman, who in reality was his sister. Life has these twists that only God understands, doesn't it? Our house on Maple Street was modest, with only 3 bedrooms, one for us, one for the boys, and another for Marianne. Where would we put Helen? But looking at Anthony's face, at that genuine happiness that I had never seen in him before, how could I say no? "We can transform the little sewing room into a room for her," I suggested, watching his eyes light up with gratitude. "It's not big, but it will be cozy." In the days following his discharge from the hospital, I dedicated myself to preparing the house for our new guest. I cleaned out the little room I used to store my threads and fabrics. I asked our neighbor Joe for help installing a small bed we bought secondhand. I put new curtains on the windows and fresh flowers in a small vase on the dresser. I wanted Helen to feel welcome, to know she had a place in our family. The children were excited at the news that they would have an aunt. In 1966, in our small town, the arrival of a new resident was always cause for curiosity and excitement. Charles, at 7 years old, asked every 5 minutes if Aunt Helen was arriving yet. Marianne, 5 years old, wanted to know if her aunt would tell her stories, like I did. And little James, only 3 years old, repeated auntie several times, testing the new word on his tongue. The day Helen arrived at our house was etched in my memory as if it were yesterday. It was a sunny Saturday in September. Anthony, still recovering from the accident, was sitting on the porch, waiting anxiously. The children ran around the yard, unable to contain their excitement. And I, my heart pounding, was giving the final touches to the special lunch I had prepared. Fried chicken with mashed potatoes and gravy, Anthony's favorite dish from when he was a boy. When the taxi stopped in front of our house, I saw Anthony stand up with effort, leaning on the cane he would use for the next few months. Helen got out of the car with a small suitcase in hand, dressed in a simple sky-blue dress and a scarf on her head. She looked at the house, at the children who were now frozen with shyness, and finally at her brother. A smile that seemed to light up the entire block appeared on her face. "So this is your family, my brother," she said with tears in her eyes. Anthony just nodded, unable to speak with emotion. It was Charles who broke the silence, running up to her and proudly announcing, "I'm Charles. I'm 7 years old, and I already know how to read." That made us all burst into laughter, breaking the initial tension. Helen bent down to be at his height, the same gesture that Anthony always made with the children. It was impressive how some habits and mannerisms were identical between them, even after so many years apart. "I'm very happy to meet you, Charles. Your mother told me you're a very smart boy." Marianne and James approached too, drawn by their aunt's sweet voice. Soon Helen was sitting on the porch step with James on her lap and the other 2 children at her side, telling them what Boston was like, the big city where she had lived for many years. It was a magical afternoon. We all had lunch together, with Helen praising my cooking with every bite. Afterwards, she took gifts she had brought for the children out of her suitcase. A car for Charles, a doll for Marianne, and a teddy bear for James. They were simple toys, but the children were delighted. At night, when we finally managed to put the children to bed, after much insistence from Helen to tell just one more story, the 3 of us sat in the living room. Anthony, visibly tired but happy, was leaning back in his armchair. I served coffee for us, that very American ritual that always accompanies good conversations. "Thank you for receiving me in your home, Cecilia," Helen said, holding my hand. "I know it can't have been easy for you, especially after everything that happened." I looked at Anthony, who was watching us with a mixture of exhaustion and contentment. I realized at that moment that something had changed within me too. The initial resentment, the irrational jealousy I felt when I discovered the photo, it had all transformed into something different. It was as if I too had gained a sister. "This is your home now, Helen," I replied sincerely, "for as long as you want to stay." What was meant to be a temporary stay of a few weeks turned into months. Helen fit into our routine as if she had always been part of it. In the morning, while I prepared breakfast and got the children ready for school, she took care of the garden we started together in the yard. In the afternoon, she helped me with the household chores and stayed with James while I went to pick up the older children from school. At night, she enchanted us all with stories of life in Boston and with the few memories she had of childhood with Anthony. One night, when the children were already asleep, I found Helen on the porch, looking at the stars with a distant gaze. I sat down next to her on the wooden bench that Anthony had made years ago. "A penny for your thoughts," I said, using the expression my mother always used. Helen smiled. "I was thinking about how life takes unexpected turns, Cecilia. For so many years I lived alone, believing I would never see my brother again. And now I'm here, part of such a loving family." We sat in silence for a few moments, just enjoying the night breeze and the starry sky of our small town. "You know," she continued, "our mother never lost hope of finding Anthony. Even in her last days, when she was already very ill, she said she felt that one day we would reunite. I felt a lump in my throat thinking about that mother who died without seeing her son again. She would have been very happy to see you 2 together again." Helen nodded, her eyes tearing up. "Mom always said Anthony had our grandfather's eyes and her father's smile. I can see that now when I look at him. It's as if a part of her were alive in him." That night, I understood more deeply the void that both Anthony and Helen had carried throughout their lives, a void that was now beginning to be filled, not only by their reunion, but by the new family we were building together. As the months passed, Helen became indispensable in our house. The children adored her, especially Marianne, who followed her aunt everywhere. Anthony was slowly recovering, both physically and emotionally. It was as if each conversation with Helen, each shared memory, each laugh, helped heal an old wound. In November 1966, Helen announced she was thinking of returning to Boston. "I need to resolve some pending matters, sell the house I inherited from my husband," she explained during dinner. The silence that followed was broken by Marianne's immediate crying. "I don't want Aunt Helen to go away," sobbed the girl, expressing what we all felt. "And who said I'm really going away?" Helen replied, hugging her niece. "I just need to resolve some things over there. Then, if your mom and dad allow, I'd very much like to come back and stay with you." I exchanged a glance with Anthony, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "This will always be your home, Helen," I said, feeling genuine emotion in my voice. "There will always be a place for you here." Helen stayed in Boston for almost a month. It was the saddest Christmas for the children, who terribly missed their aunt. They even made a special Christmas tree, decorated with drawings and messages for her. "For her to see when she comes back," Charles explained with the simple logic of a child. Anthony also felt the absence of his sister. At night, after the children were asleep, he would sit on the porch, looking at the road, as if expecting Helen to appear at any moment. "Do you think she'll really come back?" he asked me one night, revealing an insecurity he rarely showed. "Of course she will," I replied, sitting next to him and holding his hand. "She found her family after so many years. Do you think she'll give that up easily?" He smiled, a little more reassured. "Thank you, Cecilia, for everything, for accepting Helen into our home, for understanding the situation. I know it wasn't easy for you at the beginning." I squeezed his hand affectionately. "You know what enchanted me about you when we met, Anthony? Your capacity to love deeply. I see it in the way you care for the children, how you treat me." "It was that love that you kept for your lost sister?" How could I not understand? Helen returned 2 days before the new year to the general joy of the family. She brought a slightly larger suitcase this time, and news that would change our lives. She had sold the house in Boston and bought a piece of land in our town, just 2 blocks away from our house. "I'm going to build a little house there," she announced during the New Year's Eve dinner. "That way, I'll be close to you but not taking up space in the family." Anthony protested immediately. "Your family, Helen. You're not taking up anything." She smiled, that smile that I now recognized as a signature mark of the siblings. "I know that, my brother, but you're a young couple with growing children. You need your space, and I need mine too. But I'll be so close that the kids can visit me every day after school." While the children celebrated the idea of having their aunt always nearby, I reflected on how life had completely changed in just a few months. The mysterious photo I found in Anthony's wallet, which had made me shed so many tears, believing it to be of a lover, had brought me not a rival, but a friend, a sister-in-law, an aunt for my children. Fate has those ironies. 1967 began with a new energy in our house. Anthony had completely recovered from the accident and returned to work at the post office with renewed vigor. Helen and I started a small venture together, a sewing shop in the back of the house. She had learned fine sewing in Boston, and I always had a knack for needle and thread. We started making clothes for the children, and soon we were accepting orders from neighbors and friends. The construction of Helen's house began in March. Anthony supervised the work on weekends, and even Charles helped, carrying small bricks and feeling important. It was a family project, a way of telling Helen that she really was part of our lives. Now in July, during the school holidays, we took the children to visit Boston. It was the first trip we took together, and Helen was our guide. She showed us the tourist spots, the best restaurants, the neighborhood where she had lived with her husband. She also took us to the cemetery where her mother, the mother-in-law I never met, was buried. It was a scene I'll never forget. Anthony, kneeling before his mother's grave with Helen at his side, their hands intertwined, tears silently flowing. The children, sensing the solemnity of the moment, remained quiet, respectful. Charles, always the most sensitive, took my hand and squeezed hard. "Their grandma is happy now, isn't she, Mom, because they're together again." At that moment, I was certain that everything had happened exactly as it should. The photo in the wallet, my discovery, Anthony's accident, Everything had led us to this moment, to this family reunion that transcended even death. Helen's little house was completed in November 1967, just in time for us to celebrate Christmas. It was a simple but cozy house, painted a light yellow with white windows. Anthony made a point of planting roses in the small front garden, their mother's favorites, according to Helen. The children helped decorate the interior, each choosing a special ornament to give to their aunt. Charles chose a picture frame for the photo we had taken on our trip to Boston. Marianne gave a small crocheted doily that she had learned to make with me. And little James, at 4 years old, painted a rock with colorful paint. For good luck, he explained seriously. The housewarming was a small party for the neighborhood. The women brought cakes and pies. The men helped set up tables in the yard, and the children ran among the adults, enjoying the freedom of that special day. I remember watching Helen receiving the guests with her delicate manner and that smile that resembled Anthony's so much. She was no longer a stranger in our community. She had become part of us, a beloved neighbor, the loving aunt, the sister-in-law I never imagined having. The following years were what I now call our golden years. The sewing shop I started with Helen prospered beyond our expectations. We started sewing in a small room at the back of my house, but by 1969, we could afford to rent our own space on the main street of town. We hired 2 helpers, Mrs. Zoe, a widow who had blessed hands for embroidery, and Lucy, a young woman who was enthusiastically learning the trade. Our specialty was wedding dresses and clothes for special occasions, but we also made school uniforms and general repairs. Anthony was promoted to post office manager in 1968, which brought more financial comfort to our family. We could finally change the living room furniture, buy a new refrigerator, one of those modern ones with a separate freezer, and even acquire our first car, a navy blue Volkswagen Beetle that became a sensation among the children. Sunday mornings became a sacred ritual for our extended family. After church, everyone gathered at my house for a special lunch. Helen always brought dessert. She was famous for her apple pies and seasonal fruit cobblers. Afterward, while she and I tidied up the kitchen, Anthony would take the children and some neighbors to play baseball at the field near the school. Later, when everyone came back sweaty and hungry, we served coffee with cake on the porch and talked until sunset. They were years of prosperity, not just financial, but emotional. Seeing Anthony and Helen rebuilding the bond that was stolen from them in childhood was like witnessing a daily miracle. They had developed their own language made of inside jokes, references to newly discovered memories, and a silent understanding that only siblings possess. The children grew strong and healthy, surrounded by family love. Charles, always studious, dreamed of being an engineer. Marianne had inherited our talent for sewing and spent hours learning new stitches with me and her aunt. James, the youngest, was the artist of the family. He was constantly drawing and had a limitless imagination. But not everything was roses, my dears. Real life has its trials, its dark valleys that we need to cross to reach new mountains. The first major challenge came in 1971, when Anthony began to feel severe pain in his back. At first, we thought it was a consequence of the car accident he had suffered years earlier. But the tests revealed something much more serious, a problem in his spine that required delicate surgery. It was Helen who found the doctor in Boston, a renowned specialist who had studied in Germany. I remember the fear I felt when I learned the price of the operation. It was an amount I never imagined I would one day need to pay. All the money we had saved for the children's college would have to be used. The night before the trip to Boston, after the children went to bed, I sat on the bed beside Anthony, holding his hand. "Everything will be fine," he said, trying to reassure me, even though he was the one facing surgery. I swallowed my tears and nodded, trying to appear strong. "Of course it will. And when you return, we'll celebrate with that barbecue you love so much." Helen went with us to Boston. She stayed by my side during the 8 hours Anthony was in the operating room, holding my hand, bringing me coffee, praying with me. When the doctor finally came out to say the operation had been a success, we fell into each other's arms, crying with relief. Anthony's recovery took months. He had to be away from work, which meant a significant reduction in our income. It was a period of financial tightness, but never despair. The sewing shop became our main source of support, with Helen and I working until late at night to keep up with the orders. Charles, at 12 years old, got a part-time job delivering newspapers to help with expenses. Marianne took care of the house, and James when I wasn't there. We were a team, a family that supported each other in difficult times. In 1972, when Anthony was finally able to return to work, even with restrictions, we felt we had overcome a great trial. Our family was stronger, more united, and I had discovered in myself a strength I didn't know I possessed, the ability to support my family, to be the pillar when necessary. The second major challenge came in 1975, and this time it was Helen who needed us. During a routine examination, doctors found a lump in her breast. The diagnosis came like lightning on a blue sky day: cancer. At that time, breast cancer was almost a death sentence, especially in small towns like ours, where medical resources were limited. But we refused to passively accept this. If Helen had waited 30 years to reunite with her family, we weren't going to lose her now. It was Anthony who organized everything, sold the Beetle and bought an older one to get extra money, mortgaged part of the house, borrowed from friends, all to get the best possible treatment for his sister. Helen was operated on in New York at the newly opened cancer center. The surgery was radical, a total mastectomy, as it was called at the time. I stayed with her during the 2 weeks of hospitalization, sleeping in a chair beside her bed, holding her hand on the nights when the pain was most intense, promising that everything would be fine, even when I wasn't sure of that. The period of chemotherapy that followed was brutal. Helen lost her hair, drastically lost weight, got nauseous from any food smell. Seeing her suffer like this, after all she had already gone through in life, seemed a cruel injustice of fate. But you know what I discovered during this time? That Helen's strength wasn't in her body, but in her soul. Even on the worst days, she found reasons to smile. When the children visited her, she made a point of sitting up in bed, putting a colorful scarf on her head, and telling funny stories, as she always did. "I don't want them to see me as a sick person," she told me. "I want them to remember the Aunt Helen they knew." During the 6 months of treatment, our sewing shop suffered. We couldn't handle all the orders without Helen, and I had to drastically reduce our work to be able to care for her. Once again, the entire family united to face the challenge. Charles, now 16, got a better part-time job at a mechanic's shop. Marianne, 14, took on many of the household responsibilities. Even young James, at 12, did his part, reading stories to his aunt on the days she was too weak to talk. In December 1975, we received the best Christmas news. The tests indicated that Helen was responding well to the treatment. The cancer seemed to be in remission. It was a Christmas of gratitude, of tears of joy, of renewed promises. Helen's recovery was slow but steady. In 1976, she was able to return to work at the shop, even if only for a few hours a day. At first, her hands shook when holding the needle, but she soon regained the skill she always had. Customers who knew about her illness came especially to be served by her, bringing small gifts, a homemade cake, flowers from the garden, a prayer written on a piece of paper. Helen was never the same physically. The treatment had taken its toll, but spiritually, she flourished in a way that inspired me daily. Her ability to find joy in small things, her gratitude for life, her unconditional love for the family she had rediscovered so late, all of this made her a luminous presence in our lives. In 1977, when she completed 2 years of cancer remission, Helen presented us with an idea. She wanted to organize a support group for women with breast cancer in our region. At the time, it was a taboo subject, something women suffered in silence, hidden by shame and fear. Helen wanted to change that. She started with small meetings in her living room. 3, 4 women at first, all looking down, hesitant to share their experiences. But Helen had a gift for making people open up. She shared her own journey without filters, the discovery of the lump, The paralyzing fear of the diagnosis, the surgery, the chemotherapy, the days when she wanted to give up. "But look at me now," she would say with that smile that lit up the room. "I'm here. I survived. And you will survive too." The group grew. Soon women from neighboring towns began to appear. The pastor gave us a room in the church for the larger meetings. Helen started sewing small heart-shaped pillows to distribute to women who had undergone mastectomy. They helped relieve the pain and served as a reminder that they were not alone. Anthony watched his sister's work with immense pride. "You see how it works, Cecilia?" he said to me one night as we watched Helen guiding a newly diagnosed young woman. "All the pain we go through in life can be transformed into help for someone else." Those words stayed with me. All the pain we go through can be transformed into help for someone else. Wasn't that exactly what we were living? The suffering of Anthony and Helen's separation in childhood, the anguish I felt when I found that photograph and imagined an affair, the accident, the illness, everything had shaped us, strengthened us, prepared us to help others on their path. At the end of 1978, we organized the first pink walk in our town. 50 women, most of them breast cancer survivors or supporters, walking through the main streets with pink banners and balloons. It was a revolutionary event for our small, conservative community. Some people closed their curtains when we passed, others looked on with disapproval, but many applauded, joined us, offered water and hugs. Helen walked at the front with a pink scarf on her head. Even though her hair had grown back, she wore the scarf as a symbol of solidarity with women who were still in treatment. At her side, Anthony proudly held one end of the main banner. And I walked right behind, thinking about how life takes unexpected turns, how that photograph found years ago had triggered a series of events that now resulted in this moment of unity and hope. The 1980s arrived, bringing winds of change for our family. My children, those little ones who once ran to meet Aunt Helen when she arrived from Boston, were now young adults charting their own paths. Charles, my firstborn, graduated as a civil engineer in 1981, fulfilling the dream he had nurtured since he was a boy. I still get emotional remembering the graduation. Anthony, Helen, and I seated side by side in the audience, the three of us with tears in our eyes when he went up on stage to receive his diploma. That night, during the family celebration, Charles made a toast I'll never forget. To my parents, who taught me the value of honest work, and to my Aunt Helen, who showed me it's never too late to find those we love. Marianne followed in mine and Helen's footsteps, but elevated our craft to another level. After working years in the shop with us, she got a scholarship to study fashion design in New York. In 1983, at 22 years old, she opened her own boutique in the Big Apple. Cecilia Helen Atelier was the name in gold on the elegant facade, a tribute to the two of us who had taught her the first stitches. The pride I felt seeing our names immortalized in my daughter's dream is indescribable. James, my free-spirited little one, chose a path that initially frightened us. In 1984, at 21 years old, he announced he would travel across Latin America with just a backpack and his camera. Anthony was apprehensive. I cried in hiding for nights, but it was Helen who made us see the situation with different eyes. "Let the boy fly," she said in that serene way she had of facing life. "He has the whole world to discover and stories to tell, and he'll always have a home to return to." Helen was right, as always. For 3 years, James traveled through countries whose names I barely knew. He sent letters and incredible photographs that decorated our living room wall, the snow-capped mountains of Peru, beaches in Chile, forests in Colombia. In 1987, he returned to the United States with a published book of photographs and enough stories to entertain us for months. While our children built their lives, Anthony and I adapted to the new phase of the empty nest. We retired in the early 1980s, he from the post office after 30 years of dedicated service, I from the shop which I passed into the competent hands of our employees, maintaining only a consulting role. Our routine transformed. Mornings were for tending to the garden we expanded in the yard. Afternoons for visiting friends, doing volunteer work at the church, or simply sitting on the porch hand in hand, watching life pass by on our quiet street. The evenings were often spent at Helen's house, playing cards, watching TV shows, or just talking about the old days and new happenings. Helen continued with her support group, which now served women with various types of cancer and their families. The small group that started in her living room transformed into a formal association with its own headquarters, trained volunteers, and even a doctor who offered free consultations once a week. She had transformed her pain into a movement of solidarity that saved countless lives, not just in the physical sense, but mainly in the emotional sense. In 1985, when Helen completed 10 years free of cancer, we organized a big celebration. The parish hall was decorated with pink flowers, posters made by the women from the support group, and photographs that told the story of her journey. More than 100 people attended, patients she had helped, grateful family members, doctors and nurses who had become allies to the cause. It was a night of many tears, but the kind that cleanse the soul, that heal. Anthony gave a moving speech that night. He talked about the 30 years he spent searching for his lost sister, about how he almost lost her again to the disease, and about the infinite gratitude he felt for having her in his life. "Helen is not just a survivor," he said with a choked voice. "She's a light that illuminates the path for others to find hope in the darkness." Watching the two of them together that night, Anthony already with completely white hair at 52 years old, Helen with her face marked by expression lines at 50. I thought about the long journey we had traveled since that day in 1965 when I found the mysterious photograph in his wallet. How could I have imagined that the discovery that caused me so much pain at the time would be the beginning of such a beautiful story of reunion, overcoming, and love? Destiny, my dears, has those surprises. Sometimes, what seems like a tragedy is just the first chapter of a wonderful story that's still being written. The following years brought immense joys with the arrival of the grandchildren. Charles married in 1986 to Teresa, a work colleague, and in 1987, my first grandson, Ryan, was born. Marianne found love with Paul, an architect she met in New York, and they blessed us with the twins Julia and Beatrice in 1989. James took longer to settle down, but when he did, it was in a surprising way. He returned from one of his photographic trips with Carmen, a Mexican historian. And in 1991, Michael was born, a boy with his father's eyes and his mother's captivating smile. Seeing our grandchildren growing, filling the house again with laughter, and running during vacations and end-of-year celebrations was a blessing that Anthony, Helen, and I celebrated daily. Helen, who never had biological children, became the most dedicated honorary grandmother those children could have. She told fantastic stories, taught old games, made cakes and sweets that left everyone licking their fingers. The little ones adored her and didn't understand why she lived in a separate house from ours. "Great Aunt Helen should live with Grandpa and Grandma," Ryan would say with the simple logic of a child. It was around 1992, when Anthony turned 59, that we noticed the first signs: small forgetfulness, confusion with dates, difficulty finding the right words during a conversation. At first, we attributed it to the natural fatigue of age, but when he got lost returning from the bakery, a path he had taken daily for decades, we realized something more serious was happening. The diagnosis came as a blow: Alzheimer's in the early stage. The doctor, a young neurologist from Boston, explained that the disease would progress slowly, stealing Anthony's memories and abilities until he became completely dependent. "How much time do we have?" I asked, holding Anthony's hand tightly, as if I could prevent him from slipping away from me. "Each case is unique," the doctor replied gently. "It could be 5 years, it could be 15. The important thing is to enjoy the time of lucidity that remains and prepare for what's to come." We left the office in silence, each absorbing the weight of that news in our own way. Anthony, always the pillar of strength in our family, suddenly seemed fragile, lost. Helen, who had accompanied us to the consultation, walked with her head down, her hands trembling slightly. not from the mild Parkinson's that was beginning to manifest in her, but from the contained emotion. It was during dinner that night, after Helen had retreated to her house, that Anthony finally spoke about the diagnosis. "I'm afraid, Cecilia," he said, looking at his own hands. "Not of dying. I'm afraid of forgetting you, our children, our grandchildren, forgetting Helen after spending so many years looking for her." I held his hands between mine, feeling the weight of each word. "Then, let's ensure you remember for as long as possible, and when you can no longer remember, I'll remember for both of us. I'll keep every memory, every moment, like a treasure." In the years that followed, that's exactly what we did. We created a memory album for Anthony, a large book with photographs from all phases of our life, with detailed captions explaining each event, each person. We recorded cassette tapes with stories from our youth, of how we met, the birth of the children, the reunion with Helen. Our children, understanding the gravity of the situation, visited more frequently, bringing the grandchildren, filling the house with life and memories. Helen moved into a small annex we built at the back of our house. "To make it easier," she said. But we knew it was to be more present, to help care for Anthony, to not miss any precious moment with the brother she had rediscovered so late in life. The progression of the disease was as the doctor predicted, slow but relentless. By 1995, Anthony already needed constant supervision. He confused the names of the grandchildren, forgot how to tie his tie, sometimes got lost in simple conversations, but he still had moments of crystal clarity when he was the same Anthony as always, affectionate, good-humored, full of stories to tell. One of these moments occurred at Christmas 1996. The whole family was gathered at our house, children, daughters-in-law, son-in-law, grandchildren. The table was set on the porch, decorated with flowers from our garden. Anthony, who that day seemed especially lucid, asked to speak before dinner. "I want to thank," he said, looking at each face around the table. "Thank you for this wonderful family we built together. Thank you to my Cecilia, who found a photograph in my wallet so many years ago and, instead of just accusing me, had the courage to ask who Helen was." Eyes turned to me, surprised. We had never told the children the true beginning of the story, how I discovered the photo, the weeks of anguish, thinking Anthony was cheating on me, the confrontation at the hospital. "Without your mother's courage," Anthony continued, "I might never have found my sister. Perhaps Helen and I would have spent the rest of our lives apart, as our parents wished. But destiny had other plans." Helen, sitting beside her brother, took his hand. Tears were silently streaming down her face, but she was smiling, that smile she shared with Anthony that had illuminated our lives for so many years. "So, I propose a toast," Anthony concluded, raising his glass with the hand that wasn't holding Helen's. "To the family we choose, to the courage to ask difficult questions, to love that survives any distance and any time." It was the last Christmas that Anthony was truly present with us. In 1997, the disease accelerated its course. He began having difficulties recognizing people, dressing himself, performing basic day-to-day tasks. Helen and I took turns caring for him. She, even with her more fragile health due to age and the sequelae of cancer treatment, insisted on doing her part. "He's my brother," she would say when I suggested she rest. "I spent 30 years without being able to care for him. I'm not going to waste a single day now." In September 1998, Anthony had a serious fall at home. The diagnosis, a hip fracture that required immediate surgery. At 65 years old, and with health already compromised by the progression of Alzheimer's, the risks were high, but we had no choice. The surgery was successful, but Anthony never fully recovered. He remained bedridden, dependent on constant care. Helen and I, with the help of a nurse who came for a few hours each day, dedicated ourselves entirely to him. We bathed him, dressed wounds, fed him, turned him in bed to prevent bed sores. We talked even without knowing if he understood what we were saying. In the most difficult moments, when fatigue overwhelmed me, or when the sadness of seeing my life companion in that condition seemed unbearable, Helen was my fortress. "Remember who he was," she would say. "Not what the disease has made of him, but the man we loved, the brother who never gave up finding me, the father your children admire, the grandfather your grandchildren adore." That's Anthony's true essence, and no disease can take that away from him. On an afternoon in April 1999, while we were taking care of Anthony, I noticed that Helen seemed more tired than usual. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling more than normal. "Are you all right?" I asked, concerned. "I just need to rest a bit," she replied with a weak smile. "Age is taking its toll." I insisted she go lie down, ensuring that I would care for Anthony alone for the rest of the day. She agreed, which was already a sign that she really wasn't feeling well. Helen rarely accepted moving away from Anthony. That night, when I went to call her for dinner, I found her sleeping so deeply that I didn't have the heart to wake her. I left a note saying I had saved food in the refrigerator in case she woke up hungry. The next morning, when I entered Helen's room to see how she was, I found her lying exactly in the same position as the night before. Her face was serene, at peace, but her body was cold. Helen had passed during sleep, silently, as she lived much of her life. The doctor said it was a massive heart attack, that she probably didn't feel pain. A peaceful death after a life that, despite the challenges, was rich in love and purpose. But for me, for our family, it was a devastating loss. How could I tell Anthony that his sister, whom he had searched for 30 years and lived with for another 33, was no longer among us? In his increasingly rare moments of lucidity, he still asked for her. "Where's Helen? Will she come today?" I decided not to tell him. Perhaps it was wrong. Perhaps it was cowardice, but I couldn't imagine inflicting that pain on him, even without knowing how much he would really understand. When he asked about Helen, I would say she would soon visit him, that she was busy with the support group or resting at home. Sometimes he accepted the explanation and soon forgot. Other times he became agitated, as if in some corner of his mind he knew something important had changed. Anthony passed away 6 months after Helen, in October 1999. It was a peaceful Sunday morning. I was sitting beside his bed, as I did every morning, reading to him excerpts from books he used to enjoy, even without knowing if he still understood. Suddenly, he opened his eyes, those brown eyes that once shone with joy, love, hope. For a brief moment, he seemed to really see me, recognize who I was. "Cecilia," he said with a clarity he hadn't shown in months. "Helen is calling me. It's time to go." Those were his last words. Minutes later, he closed his eyes, and his breathing became slower and slower until it completely ceased. He departed without a last goodbye, without drama, as if he had just decided to join the sister he loved so much. We buried Anthony beside Helen in our town's cemetery, a single headstone for both, with the inscription, "Siblings in life, inseparable in eternity. True love transcends time and distance." Today, 26 years after losing them, at 83 years old, I cherish the photograph I found in Anthony's wallet that distant afternoon in 1965. It's in a special frame in my living room, beside more recent photos of Helen with our children and grandchildren. Sometimes I hold the photo in my hands and think about how a simple black and white image completely changed the course of our lives. The discovery that could have destroyed our marriage ended up enriching it in ways I could never have imagined. It brought Helen into our lives, completed Anthony's family, expanded our hearts, and taught us profound lessons about forgiveness, trust, and the power of true love. If there's a message I'd like to leave you with, my dears, it's this. Behind every challenge, every pain, every misunderstanding, there can be a greater purpose that we can't yet see. Life rarely follows the path we plan, but it often leads us exactly where we need to be. That photo of another woman in my husband's wallet wasn't the end of my love story. It was just the beginning of an even bigger, more beautiful, and more meaningful story than I could ever have imagined. Before I say goodbye, I'd like to thank all of you who watched until the end. It's been an honor to share my story with you. If this story touched your heart, please leave your like, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment where you're watching from. Each comment gives me immense joy and makes me feel that my story is touching hearts across America. Until next time, my dears. And remember, true love always finds its way.